Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam. In today's video, I want to talk about something that I've realized more clearly in the past few days. And that is this idea that hate, fear, jealousy, everything that we consider to be part of our shadow, part of the things that we don't want to see about ourselves, are forms of love that have simply become too narrow, or which are being expressed and felt in a rather narrow way. And before I launch into explaining why I believe that's the case, or rather demonstrating that that's the case, if I want to be a bit more convincing about it, I think it's important to highlight why this is important. Why is this important to know? And it has to do with how fear and hate are hidden with shame. They are hidden by shame. They are hidden by shame because we have classified them as things that should not be part of us, or things that, because they are part of us, make us less worthy of love. In other words, we assume that fear and hate, being part of us, makes us guilty of having evil intent. And when something or someone has evil intent, it's less worthy of love. That would unbalance the scales of fairness. And we long for fairness as much as we long for love. So to gratuitously give love to someone that is evil and guilty of feeling fear, feeling hate, jealousy, and those kind of things, envy. Being guilty of these things is correct when we see these things as coming from evil intent. So they're covered with shame that makes them all the more difficult to bring to the surface. We're too embarrassed to admit these things even to ourselves. The consequences, the loss of love that we think we would face because of these things is tremendous. So we bury them. And once buried, they of course become part of our shadow, and we have buried parts of ourselves that are an integral part of who we are. Not only that, but also, as I said, a form of love. And that's where the cut happens, because as it turns out, the fact that we are engaging in things like fear and hate only come to show that that's the best kind of love that we can show in certain circumstances of life. Perhaps in many circumstances of life, perhaps in only a few. But whether it's many or a few, the fact that we feel hatred or anger or envy or fear or rage perhaps is only an indication that in that particular area of life, our love has become very, very narrow. And that's because in that particular area of life, our sense of self is narrow. You see, we only ever really love the self. When that self is defined around just our mind and our body, then our love is egoic in nature. It's narrow in nature. When our self is defined as, or rather experienced as, the whole world, then our love is infinite in nature. So, as usual, the problem is not one of evil intent or being more hateful than loving. The problem is one of identity and how narrow or broad our sense of self is experienced. That is the determining factor to how broad our love is, because, as I said, we only love the self. And when the self is defined as everything, you cannot help but love everything. It's not an effort, it's what you do by definition, because you only have ever loved yourself. But through trauma and the way that our nervous system develops, and the things about shame and guilt that I was explaining, our sense of self becomes narrowed down to our mind and our body versus everything else, in opposition to everything else. And so our love is very narrowly defined. Now, love that is narrowly defined takes the form of fear and hate, but it's still love. It's just that it's defined so narrow that it rather pokes instead of cushion, right? It's like a needle instead of a pillow, right? A pillow is cushiony and round and open. A needle is sharp and pokey, and it stings when you use it. So narrow love, such as fear and hate, it hurts. It creates pain for yourself and others. Broad love, in the form of a pillow, is cushiony for yourself and others. Okay? But again, it's not about trying to love better. It's about how you define yourself. Your identity is as limited as the parts of your psychosomatics that you're cut away from. If you're very much cut away, or very much cut off from the neck down, which most people are, then your form of love will always be narrow in nature. And as we start to do the work of self-cultivation, and we start to colonize our somatics, not just our peripheral somatics like arms and legs and stuff, but really our throat, our heart, and our belly. When we start to colonize those, not only do we let our mind completely permeate the body, but the breaching of those psychosomatic barriers, or the dissolution of those gaps, let's put it differently, also dissolve our narrow sense of self. The gaps in the psychosomatics are the city limits of who we consider yourself to be, me. Right? When you say me, that me is determined by the limits that hold your personality together through psychosomatic cuts in your system. So as we diffuse or bridge these cuts, as we connect more to ourselves on a psychosomatic basis, our sense of self becomes permeable until it is completely open and compenetrated with what used to look like the world. So now the entire world is your body, so to speak, is yourself, or what you perceive as self. So you naturally protect it and love it, as you have always ever naturally protected and loved what felt like safe, or self rather. It's just that what feels like self before we do cultivation is very narrow, it's just our mind and body. And what feels like self after self-cultivation is very broad. It starts to include everything you come across. It is not seen as other. It is not seen as non-self, because that barrier has been, or that membrane has been penetrated. I think that's a better way to describe it. So when we do shadow work, we're in a tricky situation, because the guilt and the shame will be in place. And a big part of the reason I wanted to do this video is to explain to you that guilt and shame is a misunderstanding of why you have been expressing love in toxic ways, such as hate and fear. Hate and fear are natural expressions of a narrowly defined self, not something that comes from ill intent or having something be evil about you. Okay? Therefore, you are hereby, and we are all collectively hereby forgiven of guilt and shame. Everything we do is loving. It's just a matter of, is it loving a narrow self or a broad one? And that means intent is always loving inside. And when we notice through some careful self-observation that we are feeling contentious versus another, or we feel that we need to extract happiness or experiences from others or from the world as well, then we can notice that we are coming from a narrowly defined sense of self, which is loving, for which we feel love, but which has been defined a little bit too narrow. It's just too narrow a definition. It's not the only thing that we are. So our job is to observe that sense of self and feel the lack behind it, from which it tries to then compensate. And in feeling the lack, the psychosomatics get connected, that sense of self essentially disappears, and our self becomes a little bit broader, so that our sphere of love becomes also broader. That's what we start to radiate love that encompasses everything. You can literally walk into a room and love it all because it feels like it's just a natural extension of your very own body, your very own self, from a perceptual basis. I hope that made sense, first of all, because it's a little bit complex perhaps. But you guys are really clever, and based on the comments I can tell that the content is appreciated, which is really motivating to me. So thanks for listening so far. Would love to hear what you make of this one. I'll be back with more pretty soon, and do like, share, and subscribe. Thanks. Cheerio, and bye-bye.